So let's now connect the front end that we have been building with our Supabase backend. So basically, we are going to load the facts data from Supabase into our application. And we will do this in two parts. So first, we will create a so-called Supabase client, and then using that client and also using the useEffect function on React, we will load the data into our application. So let's start by going back to Supabase. Let's make it a bit bigger here. And then I want you to come down here to the API docs. Okay, because in here, in this documentation for the API, Supabase actually tells us exactly how we can use this API. So all we have to do is here in the introduction. So let's come to this tab. So all we need to do is to read this instruction down here. So what we need to do is to install this Supabase library in our application, and then we simply copy paste this code in order to create a so-called client. Okay, so this is quite different from the way that we loaded the data in the previous section. So let's just remember that here in script.js. So here the way we loaded the data was by creating a fetch request. So using the fetch function, right? But now we will do it differently and in a better way by using the Supabase library. Okay, so we don't need that anymore. And now let's actually bring back the terminal, because we need the terminal in order to install libraries in our project. So let's come again to View and then the terminal here. And so, as I mentioned before, we still have this command here running, which serves the page to this server here, right? So that I mentioned before. So that command that we have there needs to keep running, basically. And so in order to run another command at the same time, we need to click here on this plus button. And so this then opens another terminal, which basically runs in parallel. So here we are still in our Today I Learned folder, and that's very important. And so now we can basically use this command here. So npm install, and we don't need that save part. And now add Supabase /supabase.js. Okay, so make sure you write exactly this, then hit enter, and now this will basically download this library from npm, and it will place it here in this node modules folder, just like all the other libraries that we downloaded before, including React. Just previously, we didn't do it manually, so instead, all of these libraries here were downloaded automatically by the Create React application that we used in the beginning. But now we did manually download a library, so that's Supabase, and it should be somewhere here in this folder. So just to make sure, so should be Supabase, should be here. Maybe it's up here at the add. Yeah, so right here. Here is Supabase that we just installed. Okay, but anyway, that's not super important. What matters is that now we can use this library that we just installed and in order to create a Supabase client. And this client will make it super easy for us to do multiple operations, such as filtering the data or ordering the data or many other operations. And we will explore the most important ones here in a minute and also in the next lecture. But anyway, let's now simply go ahead and copy this code here. So we can do that. Simply click here on copy. And now we could paste it all here into this file, so into our app.js. But in order to keep the file a little bit cleaner, let's create a new one. So inside the source folder, right click here and then new file, and let's call it supabase.js, and all in lowercase. Okay, then let's paste that here, give it a save, and now we just need to modify a few things. So first of all, here in this first line, we are importing this create client function from the library that we just installed. So that's Supabase.js. And then we use this function here to create a client by giving it the Supabase URL. So that's our URL, and it's the same that we used before. So it should be this one here. But for some reason, it's not, but maybe somehow it changed in the meantime. But anyway, in order to create this client, we need the URL and we also need our key. Now here in this code that we copied, we have this, which is a so-called environment variable. But we don't have that, so we will instead simply come back here, copy our API key, and then paste that there. So that's here again in project settings, and then it's right here in API, and then let's simply copy and paste that key right here. And we could also have gotten the URL from this point right here. Okay, but moving back to the API documentation here, I think we are done actually with creating this library. But going back to this documentation here, I think we are actually done with creating this client. All right, so we have our client, which is now stored inside the Supabase variable. But now we need to give this app.js file access to that variable. So right now this file doesn't know about the existence of this file and of this variable. And so to do that, we need to export this variable from here. So we write export default and then Supabase. So we exported our Supabase client from here. Now all we need to do is to come to app.js and then import that here. So let's do that right after React here, and then import Supabase from, and then open quotes, and then ./Supabase. And that's simply because the Supabase file is in the same folder as app.js. And here we can omit the .js extension. All right, and now we have access to Supabase right here. So let's now use it to fetch our data. And we are going to do that right here in the app component, because that is where we have the facts state. So the data that we're going to load from Supabase will be stored inside of this facts state. And so instead of these initial facts, we will then, of course, use the Supabase facts. All right, so we want to fetch the data from Supabase as soon as the app component renders for the very first time. So basically as soon as the application first loads. However, we do not want to fetch the data again as soon as the app component re-renders. So as a response to some state change. So we only want to load the data once, and only once the application basically initializes. And so in order to do that, we can use the useEffect hook. So that's the second hook that we are looking at. So we already learned about useState, and now we will learn about useEffect. So we write useEffect, and then VS Code might have already automatically included that here from React, and in fact it did. So useEffect has been imported automatically from React, but if for some reason you don't have that useEffect here, then make sure to manually add that. Okay, so useEffect, and now here we will pass in a function. And so this function is what we call the effect, and it will be rendered the first time that the component loads, at least for now. So function, then our code, and then we need to add in a second argument, which is going to be an empty array. And so this empty array is what will ensure that this function here actually runs only at the beginning. So only once, as soon as the app component first renders. Okay? And we will take another look at this here later. And this array is actually called the dependency array. But again, more about that later. For now, just make sure you have that empty array there, because otherwise this effect will actually be executed each time the component re-renders. And again, that's not what we want. But anyway, now let's come here again to our API documentation, and then let's click here on the facts. Okay, and now we can simply go ahead and copy this snippet of code here and paste it right here. Now here we immediately get this kind of error, and that's because we are using await outside of an async function. So we also used await before here because remember that this fetch function returned something called a promise, which is like a future value. And so we then used the await keyword in order to make our code stop, so to pause until the data arrived. Now we can only use this await keyword inside of an async function, so an asynchronous function. And so here we have the same thing. So this Supabase client that we have here also takes some time, of course, to load the data. And so we again need an async function so that we can await for that data. Now this function right here, this cannot be an async function, and so we need to create another one in here. So async function, and let's call it get facts. And then let's actually take this, cut it, and paste it here. And now we can give it a save. Okay. So here let's store that data actually in a constant, not in a let. And then the first thing that we are going to do with this data is to simply log it to the console. So this data is going to be called facts because we are destructuring the object that is coming from Supabase here into data and error, and we are then renaming that data into facts. So that's something that we haven't done before. Here we already did it automatically because we just copied that snippet, but this is also not super important. All right, so here we should already see some data. Now all we have to do is to then call this function. So get, not get, so get facts. All right, so let's save it. And then let's check out our console here. And here it is. So here is our Supabase data, but only with the IDs. And so that's because here we only selected the ID. So let's understand a little bit what the Supabase client actually does. So this Supabase variable here, this is the one that we imported here from this file where we created the Supabase client. So Supabase is our client. And so on that client, we can then call some methods. And so these methods, so this from and the select, these are methods that are coming from the Supabase JavaScript library. So that one that we included earlier in this lecture. So this is not like included in basic JavaScript and not even in React. So this is really coming from the Supabase library. But anyway, what we're doing here is to basically take our facts table and then they're selecting only the ID column. And so that's why we get these IDs. But we don't want only the ID, we want everything. And so we can just use the star. And if we then reload, we get our data again. And now we have everything there. Great. So let's again understand what happened here. So we used the useEffect function to basically run this effect, so this other function, each time that the component loads for the first time. So when we change some state here, so for example, by clicking this button, we are updating state, right? But the data is not being refetched. So we don't see any new data coming up here. And that's because we set the dependency array here to this empty array. But without this empty array, then this data would be refetched each time that some state updates. So if I click here now, you see that the data is being refetched. So of course, that's not what we want. So only on the first time the application loads. Okay, and now the final step is to not place this data in the console, but instead write in our application. So in the console, it's quite useless. So how do you think we will do that? Well, that's where our facts state comes into play. So the whole goal of getting this data was to store it into the effects state, so that when we update the state, the interface here then reflects that new state and that new data. So the first thing that we're going to do is to get rid of initial facts, and we will simply start with nothing, basically. So an empty array as soon as the application loads. So when the app first loads, we want to see nothing here. So no fake data that we had before, but instead we have this empty array here. And then also we start fetching the data immediately. So that's what we're doing here. And then as soon as the data arrive, we store it into the facts state. So for that we use set facts, and we simply pass in the data that we got. And that's it. All right, so there it is. These are exactly the 11 facts that we got from Supabase. Great. So let's reload here. And so in the beginning, you very quickly saw the 0 there. So that was before the data had arrived. And then the data did arrive. And so this empty array that we had here initially was replaced with the facts array. Now, in order to see this a bit better, what we do many times as we develop applications is to come here to this network tab in the developer tools, and then we throttle our internet. So basically we make our internet very slow. So at least we pretend that it is slow. For example, here by using slow 3G. And so if we then reload again, it will take a lot more time until the data arrives. So everything is super slow now. And so now the data was fetched. And so as you saw, it took a long time until we actually got it here in the list. So in the real world, you usually have something that indicates that some data is being loaded, like a spinning wheel or something like that, as I'm sure you have seen all the time on the internet. So that's a very common pattern, and so we want to implement something like this. So something that is showing our users that some data is being loaded instead of, well, simply having a blank screen for some time. So the data wants to know, or the user wants to know that something is happening. So let's do that right in the next video.